Hello and welcome to Morning into Dancing, the show inspired by the grace of God in my life as I have learned and grown after my childhood in an abusive, pretty crummy, weird cult from the 60s. I took the name of the show from Psalms 30 verse 11 where it says, "Thou hast turned for me my mourning into dancing." God's grace can help us turn our mourning and our trials into dancing and strength. I just love that image. Thou hast turned for me my mourning into dancing. What a wonderful contrast that is, right? You can kind of imagine a person who's down and grieving and going through a hard thing. And then they're dancing. And dancing is a joyful activity, a loving activity in many cases, right? So today's episode is called Tender Mercies in a Scientology Cult, because yes, it's splintered off Scientology. This episode, I want to focus on I want to give you an outline for what this podcast is about, what's inspired it. I got to reawaken my computer, pardon me. Okay, so I'm back. All right, so do it again. There it is. So I want to give you the rundown of what this podcast show is going to be like, what we're going to cover, and why, and then we'll get into a few specific things about mourning into dancing in my own life. And in this case, tender mercies in this cult. So first off, I got a cult called Tales from a Cult Insider. I started that 3 or 4 years ago, and it went pretty well. Finished it off. It's about 50 episodes. You can find it on any platform. It really does detail my life in that cult and day-to-day stuff, all the challenges, or a lot of stuff. It's a lot of details, lots of stories about that. It focuses on telling those stories. But it doesn't get into my faith journey. And it doesn't get into, as I look back and see Heavenly Father's hand, the grace that came to me. Often, not as often as I think some of us would like, but often enough that I get to be a happy person. So that's kind of what this whole podcast is going to be about, is finding that grace, looking back and talking about that grace, seeing how Heavenly Father's power and strength and love and attention and grace can heal us even when we don't think it can. I want to just tell you what I think grace is, and then we'll get into this podcast. So I think, I recently had shoulder surgery. It was because I screwed it up years ago and didn't really fix it for a long time. I built strength so I could do plenty of stuff around it, but it was still pretty messed up. It's been hurting since January, so I went in and discovered there was a tear. Yay. So it's been fixed. They moved the biceps tendon to my bone. It's going to heal. It's going to be better. Our bodies have a biological imperative, for the most part, to improve, to heal, to get better. Cuts heal and close. This is going to heal, and I can help it heal if I'm thoughtful and diligent in the way I take care of it, if I don't overdo it, which is hard for me sometimes. That's just this there's some healing factor in us. Some of you may even know the biology around that. I don't know it. I believe that grace is a spiritual healing factor, a spiritual lifting and improving element in our lives. And it doesn't just go away. It's there. It's just there as part of our birthright in this world. And we can access it and we can make it do better, like I'm going to do for my shoulder. I'm going to try to keep the healing process going and enhance it. And we can cut it off a little bit by fricking around and finding out, right? But I think that that's what grace is. And so as I've thought about that in my own life, I see that it's been there my whole life, undetected until after I got out of the cult. So that's really why I wanted to get into this, because I think that there's so much beauty that can come from hardship. And I think I get to see it. I'm blessed to see it. I'm lucky to see it. I'm fortunate to see it. So here we go, and experience it. So just a quick rundown of the cult. If you want to really get into the details of what the cult was, you're going to need to go listen to my podcast, Tales from a Cult Insider. You could read my first book that I published. It's called Beyond the Cabin. It's really autobiographical, but still fictionalized. What's depicted there is accurate to the T about what the cult was. It's called Beyond the Cabin. The other books are a little less autobiographical, but they're still kind of autobiographical. Anyway, real quick, the cult started in Oxford, England. It was a bunch of like-minded people who were participating in Scientology and I think another religious movement or something, and they got along real well and started doing their own thing and wound up leaving Scientology. I think they were asked to leave by the local chapter leaders, and they kept doing their own processes for whatever they were doing. I don't really understand what they were working on or trying to do, but it was the 60s, it's counterculture, whatever. They were also kind of aristocracy. They had a lot of status and money from their families, and I think that they were part of that movement of trying to challenge it all, right? Challenge the status quo. So formed their own little thing. They called it the Process. Then they turned it into an actual religious organization called the Process Church of the Final Judgment. They ended up not doing or getting kind of in a bit of trouble there in England, and they left, went to Stool, Mexico for a couple of years, and then they wound up in the States, West Coast, over to the East Coast. I was born in Chicago right before that cult schism, because the two leaders, if you want to know, Robert de Grimston and Marianne McLean, they divorced, and there was a lot of bad stuff that they were doing to each other, to the cult members. There were accurate accusations of brainwashing and other things. And it's gross. Cults are that way, right? Real cults, right? There are a lot of cults out there. There are a lot of things that people call cults that aren't cults, though. So, okay, we're not going to get into that here. I was born in Chicago right when the cult was schisming, and Marianne took her group, which she called the Foundation Faith of the New Millennium. Robert took his version, and it's still called the Process, and they're still going. He's still writing stuff. But I wound up in Marianne's, and so did just about all the kids and a lot of the other faithful for her. She turned that, again, Foundation Faith of the New Millennium, then turned into the Foundation Faith of God. Ultimately, it became Best Friends Animal Society. There were several branches, mostly in the West or Midwest, supporting the animal rescue and rehabilitation efforts that were happening first in Arizona and then in Utah, down near Kanab. Ultimately, all the kids that were born and raised in or brought into the cult were brought to Dallas. I spent a lot of time moving all over the country for a while. And then when I was in 5th grade, I was moved to Dallas with all the rest of the kids. Over a couple of years, they moved them all there to go to something called Faith School, which was a private school that they created, but only for members of, kids who were the kids of the members of the cult, to be taught by people who weren't certified, which, questionable, who cares? But in some cases knew their subject, in some cases did not know the subject, in some cases knew how to teach it, and in many cases didn't know how, and with varying degrees of desire to do a good job. So my education was interesting. I'm not going to get into that either, except for maybe later in some anecdotes and stories. One of them will be there about hot dogs and being called stupid. What a blessing that was. Yay for blessings. Anyway, so that's where I spent the last 7 years of my life, was in Dallas, in the Dallas branch, going to Faith School, 5th grade through 11th grade. What else? Let's see here. And then, like I say, there was the animal rescue thing down in southern Utah. And at around the time I was 17, members of the cult started walking out, leaving, because they were very dissatisfied. It had become basically a financial commune supporting this charity kind of organization for animal rescue. And a lot of people were not into the way they were being treated. The leader of the branch in Dallas was named Lucia. She I can't diagnose her, but she seemed like a sociopath. She was definitely megalomaniacal. She was a narcissist, and she did not seem to like kids at all. So that was the beginning. Not the beginning. That was part of the beginning of my life, was having to deal with her, and that was a challenge. She was my nemesis in my mind. Anyway, I got out after the Dallas branch kind of crumbled. I don't need to get into the transition of getting out, but I had that transitionary period of getting out, and it was good, and I'm going to get into that in the next episode. And then I landed in a place called Kanab, and I'll get into that in the 3rd episode. And those might be this episode and the next 2 might be the only linear episodes that I get into. I think the rest I want to just kind of jump around and talk about experiences and finding the grace, seeing the grace, recognizing the grace, and then doing that, choosing joy and happiness and stuff in my life. So there's I guess that sums it up pretty well. If you have any questions, you're welcome to comment below. You can email me. There we go. Okay, so I hope you're still with me so far. I want to get into some of the tender mercies that I did experience that have been really a blessing for me in my life. I don't know necessarily where some of this stuff came from. Some of it might have come from genetics. There also may have been some influence that I wasn't aware of. I do remember when I was quite little, I don't know if it was in Quakertown, Pennsylvania. There was a beautiful property there. Boy, beautiful place. Or if it was some other rural area. But I believe it was in one of the rural areas we lived in. I believe I remember my mother reading me The Pokey Little Puppy. But the only time I remember her reading it to me, I actually could already read. So I think I was 4. That may have been one of the more motherly things that she ever did. There wasn't a lot of that. Certainly there wasn't any of it. The more I grew up and the more distance there was between us. But, I believe that kids were, when born, mostly raised by their mother until they were 3 or 4 years old. And then they were essentially seeded to the cult. So one important aspect of the cult was that they preached and believed and lived by lots of different things. But one of those things was that the family unit was obsolete. The nuclear family, right, where there's a nucleus of the family, was obsolete and needed to be challenged. Those relationships weren't really useful anymore or something for the world, which is just a bunch of bunk, right? It's bogus. So, but I remember at the age of 4, her reading to me The Pokey Little Puppy and me reading it and being able to read. I don't remember being taught to read. I don't remember learning to read, but I remember that at around the age of 4, I knew how to read. And that was something that I did for a lot of my life, was read. And boy, what a blessing that has been. So The Pokey Little Puppy, Little Engine That Could, the Berenstain Bears ones, that other one by that fella, Mercer Mayer, about the crazy little guy, hedgehog, I don't even know. I love those things. I read small books. I started reading the Black Stallion books probably when I was about 6 or 7, maybe 8 at the most. Read constantly all the dang time, to the point where by the time I was in Dallas, I was reading, and I was in 5th grade, I was reading big Stephen King books, big Robert Ludlum books by the time I was 12. Tons. I mean, some of those were not appropriate. Like, most Stephen King books aren't appropriate for a kid that size, or for any human being, because while he is a pretty good writer, he doesn't necessarily know how to end books, and he really likes to be gross. He's not my cup of tea anymore. I might talk about that in one of the episodes. My evolving tastes in literature, both reading literature and the stuff I view. Anyway, but my love of reading was a tender mercy, which I really think was a gift from the Lord that I could use as a shield from the worst things, and as a way to process the worst stuff that I was going through, and as a way to also not just process it, but recalibrate myself from the crappy stuff I was going through. See, I was in an unstable situation. I didn't feel loved. I didn't feel like anybody liked me even. There was nobody I could trust. I didn't really know what would happen to me from day to day, even though I knew that I would wake up in the cult, and I'd go to the school at faith school, and da-da-da-da-da-da. We never knew if we'd be yelled at for no reason at all. We didn't know what kind of punishment there might be if we got into some arbitrary trouble. We were neglected all the time. We didn't know if there would ever be any kind of affection. I always believed there wouldn't be any affection for me, because for a while I actually thought there was something very, very wrong with me. That would explain why I was abandoned, why the God they were talking about must not love me, because I didn't see him or feel him or her in their wording. So yeah, that's the love of reading became a tender mercy for me, and I want to get into that a little bit more here in just a quick second. All right, so we're back. For you, that should have been nothing. For me, that was about 10 minutes of dealing with a thing with kids, taking some bread out of the oven, and getting a drink. Okay, so we're talking about reading and how I just loved it, and was definitely an early reader. I think I can say that's due to good genetics, but also I truly believe that was a gift from God, because I was talking about how reading became a shield and an escape, and a kind of a platform for me to recalibrate the way I thought about life and the way I thought about myself. Like I said earlier, I didn't feel like I was worthy of love. I felt like I had to earn love, earn attention, earn some kind of status. If I got into a room with some of the kids, I felt like I was beneath notice unless I had done or had something important, or was there to do something important, or had been special in some way. I still have to fight that, by the way. Boy, I tell you. Anyway. Here's what happened. I loved reading. I was reading all those books I talked about a minute ago, and I started reading more and more, and I started reading some fantasy books. And the first fantasy books that I remember reading that really just struck a huge chord were the Icewind Dale trilogy. The first one's called The Crystal Shard by R.A. Salvatore, Bob Salvatore, Robert. This is in the Forgotten Realms world, run by, at the time, TSR, now Wizards of the Coast. They're the ones who do D&D, Dungeons and Dragons. So Salvatore wrote this series in this world, which is one of the worlds for where Dungeons and Dragons stuff takes place. They were a growing, thing, and so they were expanding into fiction. And boy, I was blessed by it. Bruenor, Drizzt, Wolfgar, Cadabrai, all these wonderful characters. Regis, just they became my home. They became my friends. They became, number one, an extremely important escape from adults who didn't seem to like me, an organization that didn't seem to like me, and kids who I didn't feel like I had any connection with. Partly my fault. I self-isolated. I was convinced that being a loner, pardon me for kicking the camera, that being a loner was cool, and that was just who I was. I've since come to a new peace in that area, which is I'm not a loner, but I also sometimes don't find it worth it to try to socialize. I prefer the peace of being alone. So again, they were an escape. A world of magic, a world of heroism, a world of love, a world of fighting for something you believe in. I was surrounded by people who were espousing beliefs that they did not seem to live or even really think that were real. They just said them. And they were in this group where a lot of them didn't seem to like life. They looked depressed all the time. Or like life, did I say? I think, anyway. They seemed depressed. They seemed upset. The leader of the Dallas Prince, like I said, Lucia, she was not good. I don't want to be a mean person, but she was not good. And then there were kids, again, I didn't have a connection with them very well, even though I'd grown up with them. It's kind of a weird dynamic, right? If you think about that, these are people I've grown up with my whole life, and I just didn't feel much of a connection with them. And I think that did come from some mental illness issues, some depression, some anxiety, some self-esteem concerns, all that stuff. There was certainly as I've grown older, I've seen, that I was dealing with reactive attachment disorder, love starvation, affection starvation, among some other things as well. So, you're not going to be the most stable person when life around you is unstable. You're not going to be the most stable, emotionally healthy person when nobody's modeling good emotional health for you. When you don't, get affection, when you don't get love, when you don't have someone you can trust. We sometimes take for granted the simple family dynamic of a kid and their parent or parents, hopefully parents, where that kid can always just turn to the parent whenever they need it, to talk through something, to get a hug, to just lean on, to cry with, to get help with or from, help with math, help with writing something. My kids have all gotten that and more. Nonstop hugs and physical affection, good special time spent with each other, hard times as well that we draw us closer as a family. I did not have that, and many of the kids I was growing up with did not have that. Some did have some of that, which I didn't realize at the time. But they definitely did have some of that. But I did not. And this was not helping me be a very stable person or a very happy person or a very optimistic person. These books, though, with heroes in them, something was changing in me as I read those books. I started not only loving the books, but started thinking, I wanted to be a hero too. And the movie Rocky helped me with this, and some other kind of underdog hero movies helped me with this as well, where some person who just doesn't have much ability, much resource, rises above it all because they work their heart out. They work their heart out. They work as hard as they can. You see that in a lot of these great hero's quest stories and books. The hero has to dig so deep to win, and then they win because they dug deep enough. And I read him enough that it started to kind of become a part of me. I was being assimilated like the Borg. No, it started to just become a real part of me. And my imaginary world became a world where not only was I imagining these cool stories, I was imagining myself in these cool stories, as we often do, a very common thing, right? But then I was actually imagining myself in my future, moving forward in life, as if I had the character of one of these heroes, as if I had the fight and the heart of one of these heroes, and deciding that I could fight for true love, and deciding that I could find a true love and marry that true love and be happily ever after. If not happily ever after, be with the person with whom I can work out happiness ever after. Yeah, that's pretty cool, right? So those stories of heroes started to help me feel like I could be a hero. I could have my own quest, my own journey. My life could be a quest. And then I started thinking, especially after seeing movies like Rocky and Rudy and, the sports movies, and other underdog type stories, there are things I can't control. And I didn't think too much about those, but I did think about there are some things I can control that I can improve myself on. I can make myself a better person. I can start seeing the stuff in me that I don't like, that I don't think is going to be effective for me in my journey towards being, sorry, I kicked the camera again, being a hero. And, the process of reading these books and internalizing these books and imagining myself in the books, and then having my, that imagined character that was in the books of me, or in the adventure stories I'd imagined for myself in, become the imagined self of my real life as well, was awesome. And so I started doing things that helped me prepare for a life of questing, a life of improvement, a life of finding my true love and making a family and building a life together, fighting against evil as well. I wanted to be a paladin. All my life I've wanted to be a paladin. Just have the pure principles and then have them determine, my path forward without any question. Holding firmly to those principles. I've always wanted that. And those books helped me do it. What a tender mercy that is. In all of the darkness and the instability and the uncertainty of that cult, books became my home and my map and my protection and my safe place. And I think the other kids must have thought I was friggin' weird because I was always reading, literally always reading. Fun thing, I read every book, just about every book, in the Oak Lawn branch of the Dallas Public Library, which is very near to where the boys lived in Dallas. So I definitely read all the espionage books. I read all the fantasy books, except for a couple, I think. I read most of the romance books, all the science fiction books that I could get my hands on. I read every comic that was in that place multiple times. Lots of Spider-Man, lots of X-Men, lots of New Mutants and stuff. Lots of Superboy, Superman. I read a lot of stuff, a lot of modern adventures and stuff. I started reading Clive Cussler, Stephen King, so I read some horror as well. Dean Koontz, Mercedes Lackey, Robin Hobb, Robin McKinley, all these great authors. Patricia McKillop. I'll stop with the authors, but they were the safest place I could be, and so I was in them all the time. And I'm so grateful for that because of how much it influenced the way I could see myself and how it taught me to say, okay, if I want to be a hero, what are some aspects of me that aren't going to be conducive for me being a hero? Well, there's this temper. I have a terrible temper. I had a terrible temper. And I would blow up like crazy. There's this lying that I do. I just had this reflexive lying thing that I would do. And that's very common, unfortunately, for people who've been through the kind of thing that I went through. It became kind of a defense control mechanism to protect from stuff that I didn't know about that could maybe hurt me. So lying became that reflexive thing. I didn't like that, though. I didn't like how unhealthy I was, how I wasn't physically capable of doing very much. And so I started lifting weights. I started meditating to get a hold of my mental state and try to start figuring out what my triggers were for the temper, what I would let myself go up here so that I could go I'd go all the way down here into temper, but I could find a way to turn it off up here. That was cool. Learning to meditate and kind of get an awareness of my emotions, and then ultimately to be able to disconnect from them. And I went a little too hard on that, by the way. Coming back from that has been an interesting experience. But yeah, again, so books and the hero's quest and the hero's journey was a huge tender mercy. Probably the biggest tender mercy, not probably, definitely the biggest tender mercy. Another interesting tender mercy was just my my absolute fierce resistance to authority. I think it's interesting how the Lord works with us in this way. I became incredibly stubborn and utterly resistant to any kind of authority figure, especially an authority figure who was exercising unreasonable dominion over me. Just there was no sense to what they were asking me to do. There was no reason for it. There was no good being had. It was just to show that they had control over me. And it got me, I would get so disgusted by it, and I would absolutely flout it as much as I could. I'd flout the rules. I'd push back when I could without endangering myself, until ultimately, I couldn't endanger myself because nobody could hurt me physically. And ultimately, I couldn't be even hurt emotionally because of where I got to in that cult, and because of the hero's quest I was on. Remember, I started lifting weights, and then I started punching a bag, and I started doing a lot of other exercise and became physically well. I really was happy with where I got to there. But that fierce resistance to authority really served me well, because it wouldn't let me bow down ever. I never gave in. There were times where I had to knuckle under in order to not cause problems or danger to me or others. But always there was a part in me that was saying, I'm only doing this because I don't want to get into it. I don't want to have a fight. I don't want to endanger myself or somebody else. But my heart is still pure. I'm not giving into any of this garbage. That's cool. I didn't absorb any of the garbage that they were spewing about, lying, or they were teaching weird things about the world. They were teaching weird things about, what we should do to carve out a place in the world. And a lot of it was deceptive. And then, of course, just the weird philosophies of life. I was fiercely resistant to all of them. I was determined to be my own person and have my own beliefs, such as they were. At the time, they weren't much. But typically, I think you could probably characterize my overall belief system at the time in the cult was whatever they believe, I just don't. I don't know what I believe, but I definitely don't believe any of that garbage. That's great stuff. It made me stubborn, and it made me emotionally strong, I think. And it set me up for being able to find a place of stability in my own conviction of, not a conviction of this is what I believe, but this is what I don't believe. I don't believe any of that stuff, and I'm not going to follow any of that stuff, and I'm not going to listen to any of that stuff, and I'm not going to be taken in by the mystique of this person or that person. I'm not going to follow a cult of personality of any of these people. I'm just going to do me. I'm going to be me. I just have to hit a space bar. So now you get to see me big. What's up? Anyway, so I want to think about that some more, but I'm blessed. I have been blessed by my absolute resistance to authority. Or authority figures or dominion or something like that. Nobody should have dominion over somebody else, right? Obviously, parents have the responsibility to take care of and protect and guide their kids, but that's not seen as dominion, or it shouldn't be seen as dominion. It should be seen as responsibility. And then the last interesting tender mercy I want to just unfold real quick, and this should be quick. The episode's almost over. Stick with me, guys. Is actually not all the adults were terrible. And not all the adults who were terrible all the time. And obviously, in some cases, that's not great. So in Lucia's case, that was bad. She was an abuser, a narcissist, and a manipulator. If you're familiar with those terms and you're familiar with the behavior of people like that, they will abuse, they will manipulate, they will gaslight, they will do terrible things and really treat people horribly. But then in order to not in order to continue to maintain control over that person that they've just done terrible things to, they do a love bomb, right? So if you push at somebody with all this terrible behavior, you're going to make that person not want to be around you or be with you or be a part. They're gonna fight their lives free from your control, right? But her love bombs were to bring back. That's a common thing. She would love bomb. So she would love bomb us kids with kind of over the top stuff. Sometimes it was weird. She love bombed us, and we did a trip to New Orleans of all weird things. Lovely, loved the food, but it was weird, but good. You know, you could say, oh, but that was a cool part of your life, and it was a cool part of her life. But it was 100% a love bomb. She taught us how to make bread. I don't make that bread. I don't remember what she taught us. But anyway, yeah, good times. So that's not one of those examples of not entirely terrible adults. People like Evan, who was also Corwin. He was Corwin when I met him, and then Lucia said that was too masculine of a name. And oh, by the way, Lucia, if you think that I'm being a little mean, I'm not. She named her black cat Waffen. Look up Waffen, Waffen, and you'll see what the frick, and we'll leave it at that. So she was out of her cord. Corwin/Evan, he was overall a pretty genuine, authentic fellow. I could never understand why he would be a part of this thing. Lucia hated him because he was quite manly. He was a tall, lean fellow, very strong personality, very kind and good. And he would knuckle under her and bow down to her, bend the knee. It was weird, but he was an overall pretty okay dude. Nicole, the mother of Ananda and Alicia, dear friends of mine, pseudo-sisters essentially from the cult. She was intermittently sweet as well. She certainly doted on her kids and made sure that they were cared for, which has made a big difference in their lives. She was nice to me overall. Joanna, she was small, stout, and quite warm. She was very sweet to me. I think it was because she just absolutely was devoted to my mother, Magdalene. I don't know. Magdalene had a bit of a mystique, and she could draw people to her. A very interesting charisma she had, my mother. Joanna loved her, and I think she just decided that by extension she loved me. But Joanna was always nice, and sometimes she'd give me a hug. She actually was the source of about half of my hugs by the time I got out of that cult. By the time I got out at the age of 17, I'd probably had about 20 cults, and Joanna probably had been 10 of those. There you go. 20 from anybody in the cult who wasn't my sister. My sister hugged me every time I saw her. She was very little. I adored her. She loved me. And that was the best thing in my life for several years in that cult. She was the best thing in my life in that cult. Thank you, Emma. Anyway, that's one of the reasons Wreck-It Ralph just wrecks me. If that little girl can love me, then I can't be so bad. Remember, I thought I wasn't very good. I thought there was something wrong with me. But this little girl loved me. She was a tender mercy too. So, thank you, Lord. If she loved me, I couldn't be so bad. And so that was very helpful for me. What else? Joanna, my mother, very distant, very hard to understand. She didn't show me affection very much at all. When we crossed paths after, I was no longer in the same branch as her, it was, hey, Jared, and then a hug, and I'd have to say, God bless you, and all that. And yeah, she wasn't terrible, but she certainly wasn't what you would think a mother would be. My father, it turned out he'd been trying for a lot of years to try to keep me protected. It didn't work. But he then tried to just be with me when he could, if he could be. And some of that made a difference, I think. And then, let's see. Bethany, who's Patricia now, she was sweet. She'd cut my hair. Another person I just like, you're so nice. Why are you in this terrible thing? And then a couple folks from the kind of founder area. Well, none of them are any good. Sorry. I mean, they may have smoothed out when they were older, but and they probably had some good aspects to them. But I cannot be speaking. I don't know. Okay, I am forgiving them in the process, and I think I've come a long way. But they were such jerks. Sorry. Liars and manipulators, and they've never copped to it. And, so temporal mortal justice is never going to happen. Nor will mortal satisfaction for me, where they would acknowledge the error of everything they did to us kids, ever. So I need to let go of that a lot more, apparently. They could be nice. They could be fun. They could be interesting. They could tell interesting stories. They could be sweet. But boy, they could turn on a dime. The smallest little thing, and boy, they would be furious at you, and it was unstable and gross. Let's see. Susan was nice. My dad married her after a while. Yeah, she was nice. She went by Evelyn in the cult. Damon was genuinely a good dude. I never understood why he was in that cult. Damon was a good guy. And then some of those kids were also sweet too. And I got along with him. I got along with Tim really well. He goes by Xavier now. We just got along. I think we were a very similar vibe, both kind of uninterested in participating in the nuttiness of the cult, just doing our own thing. So he read relentlessly as well. We played a lot of cool strategy games. He always beat me. I never won a game against him that I can recall. Yeah, I don't. Anyway, so this is not good. I'm going into this too deep, but the deal was there is that, even when a lot of the people around you kind of treat you poorly, sometimes they treat you okay. And sometimes some other people around you treat you okay, I guess. But, that was a tender mercy to have people who I could sort of trust sometimes, or trust to not be incredibly awful, right? It's kind of a low bar, right? But I can't help but be thankful for them. And for the spots and pockets of okay, and the pockets of fun as well, and the pockets of good as well that they offered. They were an oasis in a rough time, and I know that the Lord's grace was there in those times, just to say, hey, why don't you relax a little bit here? Why don't you not be tensed up all the time here? Here you don't have to be tensed up. Even to this day, actually, I find myself just in tension. My body just tensed, and there's no good reason for it at all, except for habit. So that's too bad, isn't it? But I'm learning to untense. I'm learning to notice it better. So in any case, that basically concludes today's episode. That there were tender mercies in a terrible cult. It's how it always is, right? I mean, we're in a bad situation, but there's always, you could call it a silver lining, you could call it a tender mercy, you could just understand that the world is complicated, and while terrible things are happening, okay things can be happening as well. That doesn't make the terrible things not terrible, because they're just going to be terrible. It just is nice to have some nice or okay or good things happening as well. And I think that's the way of the world. The Lord has made a beautiful world and an existence that's here to, to give us richness and variety in what we experience. So anyway, next episode, I'm going to talk about a transformative transitionary period between kind of getting one foot out of the cult and then moving on to getting both feet and all the way out, and what was involved in that transitionary period, and how that was really a special opportunity for me to start transforming and to starting to build a muscle or two that could help me eventually start to recognize grace in my life. But thank you so much for watching and listening. And if you've made it all the way through this episode, thank you even more. I'd love to hear your thoughts and input on today's show, today's topic as well. And feel free to contact me. You can comment. You can contact me here on YouTube. You can email me as well at morning, not like good morning, but morning, MOURN, morningintodancingshow@gmail.com with any questions or suggestions for topics. So until next time, sit back, take a quiet moment, and find the beauty and grace in the world and in yourself.